Good afternoon. It is good to be here with you and to the scholars that are here visiting. I truly hope you enjoy your visit, that it is a time of mutual discernment, and that when you join this community in the fall, that you will come with your questions and with your own commitment to make a difference in the life of a community that is Wake Forest Divinity School. To my friend, thank you. It is always good to be with you. And to each of you who are present here today, let me say that these comments, whose witness will we believe? They are thoughts that are in process. So you will help me to think tonight as I walk through some of these thoughts that I have begun to put down on paper. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring. These familiar words are often recited without thought or serious reflection. They are uttered frequently without regard for social, historical, contextual realities embedded in often unquestioned national symbols. Allow me to suggest that we can attribute this to a refusal to confront our own complicity in promoting a form of nationalism. In so doing, symbols function as facades that suggest everyone is granted equal privileges to include freedom of expression. In an age where increasingly freedom is questioned, freedom of speech or of the press, the right of the people peaceably to assemble, we must ask ourselves whether freedom is little more than an illusion reserved for a few. For civil rights activist Ella Baker, who worked with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, it was a given for her that everyone should have an ability to exist without fear of death at the hands of unknown persons in this country. Thus, Ella's song, written by Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan and performed by Sweet Honey in the Rock, is an appeal to the moral consciousness of this nation following the 1964 murder of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. This song's message has contemporary relevance for anyone who wrestles with freedom as a concept not restricted by constitutional loopholes applied disproportionately to a targeted demographic sector. Conveying a message embodied in Ella Baker's commitment to civil and human rights, Reagan compels us to remember that freedom-loving people cannot be content if one of us is not free. And so I'm going to have you listen just to a few minutes of Ella's song.
We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. You believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. Hear me talking to you. We'll believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mother sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mother sons. believe in freedom and not rest. Sing it with me if you like it. We who believe in freedom and not rest until now. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. Cause to me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can but shed some light, I say, carry us through the gales. We who believe in freedom and not rest. Let me talking to ya. We who believe in freedom and not rest until and struggling myself don't.
Born in 1903, Baker grew up in Littleton, North Carolina. The granddaughter of formerly enslaved persons, Baker was raised listening to stories about slave revolts and her grandmother's own insurgency and defiance. In addition to the development of her sense for social justice, which she attributed to the influence of her grandparents, church played a central role in Baker's young life. As the granddaughter of a Baptist minister, she grew up in the church and described her upbringing in the Baptist church as, and I quote, important for developing the sense of the value of the human being, close quote. An alumna of Baptist-affiliated Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, freedom as embodied by Ella Baker is more than an illusion. Freedom is something that should be attainable in this realm. Ella's song suggests that the pursuit of freedom with and on behalf of others may evoke within us a measure of cognitive dissonance and restlessness. It is this internal struggle that ought to compel us to examine the ways in which our own sense of entitlement and hubris may impede another's ability to truly be free. Given a human tendency to sometimes misconstrue freedom and power, Ella's song is a clarion call to both speak out against injustice as well as to encourage others to explore the ways in which they may also participate in this difficult work. The central message of Ella's song, similar to that articulated by Ava DuVernay, draws our attention to this notion of freedom as a stratified fabrication. A dominant theme in DuVernay's documentary 13th is a notion of freedom premised on the commodification and criminalization of Black bodies. Freedom as defined in Black's Law Dictionary is, and I quote, the state of being free, liberty, self-determination, absence of restraint, the opposite of slavery, the power of acting in the character of a moral personality according to the dictates of the will, without other check, hindrance, or prohibition than such as may be imposed by just and necessary laws and the duties of social life. The prevalence in the government and constitution of a country of such a system of laws and institutions as secure civil liberty to the individual citizen, close quote. When considered chiefly in terms of freedom from many forms of external hindrance to persons as they seek to make their own choices, to express their own convictions, to be true in the public sphere to their own consciences, John C. Bennett reminds us that, and I quote, freedom is not an absolute. Any society, even when committed to the kinds of freedom of expression and action guaranteed by the American Bill of Rights and other such affirmations, may be justified at times in setting limits to freedom for the sake of public order or national security or of some aspects of publicly supported morality, close quote. However, Bennett emphasizes that the healthier the society, the heavier the burden of proof it should place on such abridgments of freedom. If we are to understand freedom and restricted autonomy, questions about who determines what constitutes just and necessary laws, as well as who benefits from such laws, may ultimately shape our perspectives of freedom and to whom freedom is or is not granted. DuVernay's research challenges viewers to question media depictions of criminals that are often synonymous with Blackness. To support her premise, that a loophole in the 13th Amendment contributed to the evolution of the prison industrial complex as a contemporary manifestation of slavery, DuVernay draws connections between slavery, incarceration, and racism. Consider these 14 facts she examines in her documentary. 1. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. 2. The U.S. prison population in 1970 was just above 327,000. The current prison population is over 2 million. 3. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution makes it unconstitutional for anyone to be held as a slave. There are exceptions, including criminals. 4. The abolishment of slavery in 1865 freed 4 million people who were formerly property and almost wholly responsible for the economic productivity of the South. This left a void in the U.S. economy, leaving officials struggling with how to rebuild and put freed Black people back to work in the most cost-efficient yet still legal way possible. 5. Following the Civil War, African Americans were arrested and imprisoned en masse for extremely minor crimes. Those prisoners were tasked with providing the labor to rebuild the economy of the South after the Civil War, thus making them slaves yet again. 6. The 1915 film, Birth of a Nation, depicted the African American male as a violent, animalistic, out of control, evil member of society. Sitting President Woodrow Wilson held a private screening of the film at the White House that was viewed as a major cinematic event. The film was widely heralded as a catalyst for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. 7. The demographic geography of the United States was shaped by the post-Civil War era. During that time, Black people were subjected to criminalization without just cause, thus resulting in many African Americans fleeing to various places throughout the country in an effort to escape the threat of wrongful criminalization by the government and law enforcement officials who aimed to keep Black communities oppressed. 8. The Nixon administration began the cycle of criminalizing African Americans struggling with drug addictions rather than increasing available resources for treatment and rehabilitation. 9. Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman allegedly admitted that the Nixon administration intentionally encouraged the public to associate African Americans with heroin in an effort to disrupt Black communities by vilifying them in the news and creating the false narrative that Black people were vicious criminals destroying the country through drug abuse and distribution. 10. Black men account for an estimated 6.5% of the U.S. population. However, they make up 40.2% of the U.S. prison population. 11. 1 in 3 Black males is expected to go to prison in his lifetime. 1 in 17 white males is expected to go to prison in his lifetime. 12. Quoting Angela Davis, DuVernay notes the prison industrial complex relies historically on the inheritances of slavery. 13. Newt Gingrich admitted that the consequences for crack and consequences for cocaine should have been the same. He described the disparity in sentencing as having been an enormous burden in the Black community. And 14. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. In light of these facts, what then is freedom? And how do we determine veracity, motive, and intent associated with public witness? Modeled on ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the abbreviated legal definition of freedom I shared earlier suggests that the product of history is not accidental and provides remarkable insights into the way in which race operates in the United States. Capitalism in this country can trace its profitability to the embodied commodification of Black bodies that were treated as complete property to be bought and sold. When we consider that this nation's citizens of African heritage, many of whom can trace their lineage back to chattel slave logs, are the only people in this purported country to be subjected to structural impediments that can be traced from the transatlantic crossing to the modern-day prison industrial complex, it is imperative that we think long and hard before we say definitively who is a United Statesian. After all, to ensure returns on investments necessitated, in many instances, instituting laws and social norms that restricted and ultimately led to the criminalization of Black bodies. The attempt to legally abolish slavery, in effect, resulted in a constitutional sanctioning of neo-slaveocracy that continues to this day, masquerading as the American carceral system. To grasp the magnitude of this issue, particularly when privatization is touted as a social good, without regard for profits that accrue to sentencing judges who are silent partners in these corporations, consider the incarceration growth of a 44-year period from 1970 to 2014. 1970, as stated earlier, 357,292. 1980, 513,900. 1985, 759,100. 1990, 1,179,200. The year 2000, 2,015,300. And 2014, 2,306,014 persons incarcerated in the United States of America. While incarceration statistics are indeed daunting, grasping the import of this moral problem is a first step in gaining insight into the extent that mandatory sentencing fuels an insatiable beast that is based on a penal system with few indicators of justice. It is this reality of Black people's constant struggle to be recognized as fully human in the United States that contrasts sharply with the mythological interpretation of freedom articulated in the Declaration of Independence. With specific attention to a loophole in the 13th Amendment, Duvernay invites us to challenge these claims in light of evidence that suggests that slavery in the form of mass incarceration suggests that freedom in the 21st century is both a stratified fabrication and an enduring question with which we must contend. Even a cursory survey or basic knowledge of the role of Baptists in influencing public opinion, often through an appeal to the faith and values of individuals, to affect specific policies through the articulation of a particular biblical informed worldview, points to a non-univocal public witness on a plethora of issues that at their core offer essential insights about freedom as a racialized religious social concept. As an example, in recognition of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, the Council of Seminary Baptists of the Southern Baptist Convention reaffirmed with eagerness the Baptist faith and message's status, quote, as the doctrinal statement that unites and defines Southern Baptist cooperation and established the confessional unity of their convention, close quote. In a statement adopted in the council's annual session, the seminary presidents assert that, and I quote, as confessional institutions, the Southern Baptist Convention's 6 seminaries stand together in this classic statement of biblical truth, close quote. Additionally, the statement declares that while condemning racism in any form, I quote, the seminaries agree that affirmation of critical race theory, intersectionality, and any version of critical theory is incompatible with the Baptist faith and message, close quote. As Jim Wallace wrote in a December 10, 2020 Sojourners article, this joint statement, and I quote, was not quite the prophetic witness we needed from our churches, given the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism we've experienced in the US, a deadly combination that has disproportionately killed Black and brown people based on demonstrably inequitable life circumstances tied to both past and current injustices. Apparently, Southern Baptist leaders see the problem as bad sociology, but what their statement truly reveals is the bad theology that still haunts the denomination founded in support of slavery. The Southern Baptist statement's failure is biblical, not just sociological. Racism in its many forms is sin. Indeed, it is America's original sin, based on the lie, the myth, the ideology, that the idolatry of white superiority or the assumption of whiteness as normative and white privilege practiced through domination, close quote. Scholars of color have long made connections between the religion of Christianity as practiced by many in the United States and the formation of race and racism, yet very few white scholars until recently have taken seriously the history of white supremacy and contemporary privileges it bestows upon its followers. In his 2017 book, The Religion of White Supremacy in the United States, Eric Weed provides a theohistorical overview of the foundations of white supremacy, with an introduction formed by a question that guides his research, Why a Religion of White Supremacy. I appreciate Weed's self-disclosed moment of cognitive dissonance in which he reveals that, and I quote, "When I saw the workings of white supremacy in the past and present, I saw myself," close quote. At the same time, from this personal acknowledgement emerges for me a series of questions and concerns about race that inform public witness. For instance, how does an unconscious recognition of oneself contribute to a perpetuation of stratifications of acceptable and unacceptable behavior in such a way that implicit biases can be minimized or disregarded altogether? When behavior is viewed from a rhetorical perspective, I am not surprised at all by an at least public distancing by some persons who self-identify as white from persons deemed to be extremists, though upon a close examination, one may find more in common than an alliance based exclusively on a socially constructed form of racial identity. After all, there are members of white supremacy groups who simultaneously present themselves as Christian. For as Ben Sanders III explains, and I quote, "Critical race theory," or some use the initial CRT, the acronym CRT, intersectionality and critical theory, is not mentioned in the Baptist faith and message. And instead, the Southern Baptist Convention's rejection of CRT and intersectionality can be traced to a June 2019 resolution. Therefore, rejection of these viewpoints in the context of this statement represents a doctrinal tangent which the Council viewed as critical to clarifying the social and religious norms of the Southern Baptist Convention. Second, the Southern Baptist Convention's unsolicited rejection of CRT, intersectionality, and critical theory comes just months after former President Trump mischaracterized critical race theory as a horrible doctrine being used to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families. The Southern Baptist Convention's unsought denunciation of CRT and intersectionality coincides with Trump's pseudo-patriotic critique of CRT in ways that clearly signify cultural and political solidarity. Moreover, when one considers the overwhelming support Trump received from white evangelicals alongside the fact that the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant evangelical denomination in the United States, with around 85% of its membership being white, it stands to reason that shared critique of CRT is more than coincidental, close quote. Whether one chooses to name or not themselves as co-religionists of an inherited tradition, this reluctance to understand whiteness as a multifaceted moral dilemma tends to deflect attention away from doing a deep interrogation of the very subject under investigation: white supremacy as a religion, as a worldview that is intricately connected to meanings of ontology. In this regard, Weed is absolutely correct that whites can, and I quote, "step back from the messiness of race at any moment," close quote, and not name racism as a national sin and racist practices as evil. It is this form of orchestrated privilege that lends itself to endorsing an uncritical examination of racialized religious rhetoric and the performance of whiteness as encoded in an import to make America great and glorious again that unwittingly conflates white supremacy as an expression of Christianity. This racialized religious performance, encouraged by the 45th President of the United States, permeates public spaces. This vitriolic infused enactment is a powerful reminder that the God of white supremacists is no more the God of justice-seeking persons than it was the God of enslaved persons of African descent. I am very much aware that for many whites, an ability to maintain familiar relationships is contingent upon an ability to make a distinction between the religious and the political. Yet Weed prompts me to consider what is at stake when white people refuse to divest themselves from myths that are foundational to that which they have come to accept as normative. In other words, how does one come to terms with an ontological, epistemological worldview that is predicated on a false construction? What values are essential to guide a deconstructive process of whiteness that will inform the ongoing work of construction and reconstruction? As a way forward, this work that must be done by whites on behalf of whites, as Robert Jones, Kristen Demez, Catherine Stewart, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, Andrew White, and others, seek to offer a critique of and response to white Christian nationalism. Given my own research on lynching and a culture of lynching in the United States, I find myself intrigued by Weed's use of Tillich as a framework by which to analyze white supremacy as constructed and operative in the United States. Concepts of place and space, when understood from a perspective of occupation, enslavement, internment, with each dependent upon xenophobic-infused rhetoric, cloaked in religious jargon and enforced by legal mandates, are helpful in analyzing that which functions as ultimate. In this regard, whiteness is centered as an ideology that functions as the chief barometer by which meaning is discerned. From this performance that situates whiteness as an epistemological site of discovery, the demonic operates subliminally through bifurcated processes that result in a form of religious hybridity from which few are willing to disengage. While Weed suggests, and I quote, white supremacist Christianity has taken possession of the U.S. ethos, close quote, I question whether it might be more appropriate to note that white Christian nationalism is the very foundation of this country's ethos. It is a religion that at its core is characterized by deception, exploitation, entitlement, and fear of the other. White Christian nationalism's existence is contingent always upon a performance of race that negates the full humanity of others. In the shadow of 21st century lynching trees, individuals who acknowledge the full humanity of all people are invited to seek creative and life-affirming ways to give voice to atrocities that daily put the lives of non-cisgendered, heterosexual white boys and men at risk of murder, deportation, or other acts of violence. As we consider whose witness we will believe, an urgent question is not necessarily where is the divine in the midst of this entrenched pervasive evil. Rather, a serious concern is how to experience the divine in such a way that life and not death is the final word. As Weed concludes in his analysis of white supremacist Christianity, and I quote, the image of the white Christ is a representation of the belief in the sacredness of whiteness within American society. As such, the sacred place of whiteness is ensured by eternally connecting it to the freedom of the citizen, close quote. We are at a crossroads in the United States where we do not have the luxury to ignore cultural realities. More than a half century on this side of preacher, activist, scholar, and Baptist pastor, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s April 4, 1968 assassination, evidence of an insurgence of white Christian nationalism serves as a timely reminder that Black lives, Jewish lives, Muslim lives, the lives of non-practitioners of white supremacist religion, trans lives, the lives of persons who question inhumane practices, such as the practice of state-sanctioned death sentences, the separation of families at specific points of entry, the busing of asylum-seeking persons across state lines. More than 50 years since Dr. King was assassinated, evidence of an insurgence of white Christian nationalism serves as a daily reminder that too many lives in these disunited states of America are seen by many as insignificant. After all, we need only reflect for a brief moment on what I describe as the creating of an icon that is often void of a thick historical recounting of the manner in which King's very embodiment as a Black man issues of patriarchy and fidelity aside, was a site for expressions of racially sanctioned hatred authorized and endorsed by supposedly law-abiding citizens. Let's be clear. Law-abiding and justice-abiding are not necessarily synonymous. As we begin to consider whose witness we will believe, a rallying cry and a rallying concern for many non-cisgendered heterosexual white men is a reluctance by one too many residents of this nation to grapple with the social analysis that informed Dr. King's dream for a beloved community. All too often, the focus is on King's oratorical style at the expense of analyzing the import of his message and its contemporary relevance. Born out of a deep sense of hope in the midst of a reign of terror, what King offers humanity is an antidote to nihilism. It is a hope shaped in the shadow of lynching trees and other symbols used to incite fear and intimidation. From trees on courthouse lawns, to high-pressured water hoses, to police clubs, to dogs. 54 years on this side of King's assassination, it is imperative that we realize that his social, historical, economic insights are antithetical to a rising oligarchy that seeks to disrupt notions of freedom and human decency. In this regard, to remember King is an invitation to engage in intersectional, contextual analyses that take seriously the role of symbols in a culture predicated and sustained on violence. The youngest and the third person of African descent to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, King dared to dream that the United States of America's Bank of Justice is solvent. King dealt with the reality of inequality in a nation that marketed itself in 1964 as the land of the free and the home of the brave, a land where Black people, poor people of all ethnicities, and women were denied basic liberties and were rarely beneficiaries of often undisclosed legacy policies that granted access to a select few while exacerbating disparities in education, employment, and housing. In 2023, King's words serve as a call to conscience. His Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech described vividly the conditions of government-sanctioned violence that Black persons and those who stood in solidarity with them were subjected when they exercised their First Amendment right of speech and collective protest. King recounted why he and countless others, and I quote, in the United States of America were engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice, close quote, provided these details. And again, this is in 1964. In Birmingham, Alabama, our children crying out for brotherhood were answered with fire hoses, snarling dogs, and even death. B, more than 40 houses of worship in the state of Mississippi alone were bombed or burned because they offered a sanctuary to those who would not accept segregation. C, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, young people seeking to secure the right to vote were brutalized and murdered. In 2023, too many children are subjected to racial profiling, and too few parents and concerned adults understand fully the school-to-prison pipeline. Jurisdictions that adopt sanctuary policies do so aware of costs associated when one challenges the injustice of an unjust law. Across the United States, voter suppression is in full force, with names being purged from records. Incarcerated and formerly incarcerated persons contend with issues of permanent disenfranchisement, and one too many people promote the lie that our votes don't matter. It is important to understand that each vote matters, and persons who expend money and energy to spin a different narrative know the importance of each voice and each vote. Or as King stated in his Give Us the Ballot speech, and I quote, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal, the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And so, our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Close quote. We cannot ignore King's description of the stark reality of 1964 that mirrors, unfortunately, these initial 58 days of 2023. As King noted, and I quote, "Debilitating and grinding poverty afflicts my people and chains them to the lowest rung of the economic ladder," close quote. This truth is a clarion reminder to avoid romanticizing exceptionalism and to acknowledge that while some citizens are taxed enough already, a small percentage of persons who are perhaps not taxed enough, with added benefits from tax loopholes, suggests that a tendency to focus on an imagined middle class and an elite minority further obscures the plight of persons who are impoverished and should prompt each of us to review our working definitions of justice and equity. Governmental programs implemented to address poverty are typically not designed to dismantle systems from which an elite few benefit financially, nor to counter the pull yourself up by your bootstraps myth. Programmatic mismanagement exacerbates a tendency to shift blame to the very people who are often ill-equipped to navigate bureaucratic systems that objectify and commodify humans. In spite of needed improvements that lend themselves to valuing the human dignity of all persons, government initiatives in the form of social safety nets can be a positive response to address life-negating conditions of the least of these in a country that continues to self-market itself as the wealthiest nation in the world. If billions of dollars can be spent on political campaign ads, surely government agencies can partner with organizations like Triad Restorative Justice, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, Equity Foresight, United Way, the Urban League, and the YWCA to guarantee access to affordable housing and provide quality preventative medical care to all residents, to dispel disparities in public education, and to dismantle systems of food apartheid. At the same time, adult recipients of TANF and SNAP, for example, are frequently characterized as lazy and increasingly dependent on the federal government for handouts, while children, about 15% of whom live in families with incomes below the federal poverty threshold, are often invisible and thus ignored. This level of blind indifference suggests a literal understanding by some persons who self-identify as Christian of a biblical injunction ascribed to Jesus that you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. This non-nuanced, acontextual interpretation refuses to consider an alternative biblical account that is coupled with a mandate that we can show kindness to them whenever we wish. When we consider the plight of persons in a republic that markets itself as a democracy built on and sustained by a capitalistic enterprise, how we treat persons who are impoverished is often in stark contrast to entitlements bestowed upon this country's wealthiest citizens. How we treat people who are economically and otherwise disadvantaged matters. For as King so aptly articulated, and I quote, "Poverty is one of the most urgent items on the agenda of modern life," close quote. Yet if, as King insisted, and I quote, "oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever," close quote, we cannot ignore that the demand for dignity, equality, jobs, and citizenship will not be abandoned or diluted or postponed. That was King. King issues a moral call to action that requires us to consider how we appropriate varied points of privilege to confront systemic sins couched in xenophobic rhetoric. A commitment to justice and equity demands that we not ignore vitriol-infused language to invoke fear of the other. Will we, as King so boldly proclaimed in 1964, and I quote, "not flinch, not be cowed, not be afraid," close quote, to stand on the side of justice. Renewed calls to understand and apply constitutional rights compel me to consider how the plight of persons ensnared, for example, in global human trafficking networks influence my own ability to grasp these and other documented truths. How we respond to issues that are sustained by capitalistic enterprise are indicators of our moral compass. Given King's generational ties to the Black church tradition, give me a little creative license here to suggest, though I have no evidence to support this claim, that when King delivered his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, the chorus of the spiritual, "I shall not be moved," reverberated in his soul. The refrain, I shall not be moved. I shall not be moved. Just like a tree that's planted by the waters, Lord, I shall not be moved. This refrain illustrates King's audacious faith. Resolute in his commitment to confront evil with a theologically informed human rights agenda, King was adamant, and I quote, that there is nothing new about poverty, close quote. With the audacity to imagine, to dream a beloved community, King's sense of audacious faith would not allow him to accept, and I quote, despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history, close quote. Audacious faith requires a type of sight that can imagine things as they should be and not as they are, so that women, for instance, will not be subjected to draconian attempts to subvert reproductive rights. As King made clear, audacious faith rejects the idea that, and I quote, the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality, close quote. With unrestrained imagination, audacious faith beckons us to name unambiguously evil cloaked in political jargon. Audacious faith demands an accurate interpretation of calls to make America great and glorious again, so that we do not unconsciously succumb to dehumanizing practices. When we consider an anti-intellectual sentiment present in too many sectors of society, creating and maintaining the beloved community demands that we remember that approximately 160 years ago, it was illegal for persons of African descent to read and write in the United States. By contrast, King had, and I quote, the audacity to believe peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits, close quote. Audacious faith must draw attention to de facto segregation that results in a rampant form of educational genocide that leaves more than one child too ill prepared to engage in public life or contribute to the social good. Audacious faith demands that we not envision higher education as an elite privilege, but rather as an avenue by which many are granted access to dream a world where their ideas are essential to influencing decisions that affect the well-being of the world's population. Creating and maintaining the beloved community is a timely reminder, as King remarked, and I quote, that in the final analysis, the rich must not ignore the poor, because both rich and poor are tied in a single garment of destiny, close quote. This suggests that careful attention must be given to the manner in which moral issues are depicted in the media. At the same time, creating and maintaining the beloved community is coupled with the responsibility to hone one's ability to discern undisclosed motives. In so doing, identify strategies that lend themselves to fostering spaces where the super rich might indeed be able to acknowledge the full humanity of impoverished persons. At the same time, instead of an informed naivety, this commitment to justice is couched in a form of realistic pragmatism that demands an ongoing assessment of human relations. For King, and here I'm quoting from The Quest for Peace and Justice, for King, creating and maintaining the beloved community demands a deep ongoing commitment to take direct action against injustice despite the failure of governmental and other social agencies to act first. To disobey unjust laws or not submit to unjust practices. To persuade without resorting to violence. To seek as an ultimate goal a community at peace with itself. to always be willing to talk and seek fair compromise, to suffer when necessary, and even risk their lives to become witnesses to truth as we see it. King encourages doers of justice to keep faith in the future, to not despair. For creating and maintaining the beloved community demands that we, as King urged in his sermon, "Where do we go from here?" that, and I quote, "This is no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates about freedom. This is a time for action. What is needed is a strategy for change, a tactical program that will bring the Negro into the mainstream of American life as quickly as possible." So far, this has only been offered by the nonviolent movement. Without recognizing this, we will end up with solutions that don't solve, answers that don't answer, and explanations that don't explain, close quote. As we consider the significance of public witness in a secular age, we are benefactors of sage advice Dr. King offered in his May 17, 1957 address, "Give Us the Ballot," delivered at the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom in Washington, D.C. He reminds us, and I quote, of the urgent need for strong, courageous, and intelligent leadership from the Negro community. We need a leadership that is calm and yet positive. This is no day for the rabble-rouser, whether he be Negro or white. We must realize that we are grappling with the most weighty social problem of this nation, and in grappling with such a complex problem, there is no place for misguided emotionalism. We must work passionately and unrelentingly for the goal of freedom, but we must be sure that our hands are clean in the struggle. We must never struggle with falsehood, hate, or malice. We must never become bitter. I know how we feel sometimes. There is the danger that those of us who have been forced so long to stand amid the tragic midnight of oppression, those of us who have been trampled over, those of us who have been kicked about, there is the danger that we will become bitter. But if we will become bitter and indulge in hate campaigns, the new order which is emerging will be nothing but a duplication of the old order, close quote. If we are to expand the dream for a more just and equitable world, we must, as King emphasized, and I quote, meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force, close quote. We must work with a determination to create a society in which the humanity of all persons is acknowledged and respected. We must, as King insisted, keep faith in the future. Let us not despair, he says. Let us realize that as we struggle for justice and freedom, that Amanda Gorman reminds us, and I quote, that while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. As persons increasingly exercise freedom of expressions that challenge prescriptive displays of patriotism, might we find ourselves at a crossroads where we too must interrogate national symbols that are part of our shared history and our collective lives. Freedom at its most base form of expression is little more than self-centered egoism cloaked in language void of any recognition or commitment to the social good. Freedom at its best, though, always invites us to consider how we use our various points of privilege on behalf of others. Freedom thus calls us to be informed, engaged citizens, committed to a process of interrogation, aware that this deep questioning may also restrict our ability to navigate life unencumbered. We need only remember slavery and Jim Crow in this country, the Third Reich, and to name a few, the Ukrainian, Cambodian, Armenian, and Rwanda genocides, to realize that freedom is always so much more than legislative and governmental initiatives. With each technological advance, our global interconnectedness is a startling reminder, to borrow in conclusion from Sweet Honey in the Rock, that we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.